This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Bob Sutton. He is a professor of management science at the Stanford Engineering School and a researcher in the field of evidence-based management. Bob lives two different lives from my perspective. The very serious Stanford professor and the really cool side persona that he has developed, side authorship. His first famous book, The No Asshole Rule, Building a Civilized Workplace and Surviving One That Isn't. That was 2007. But today, in 2017, his follow-up, The Asshole Survival Guide, How to Deal with People Who Treat You Like Dirt. What a great excuse to use the word asshole on this podcast for the first time. At least, I think it's the first time. I know there is ample swearing on this podcast, but I don't believe the word asshole has been used yet. At least not in an interview. I hope you enjoyed this great conversation with Robert Sutton. Speaking of kind of unforeseen things to happen. I mean, when I look at your resume, you've been at Stanford for a long time. I think the early 80s. You've got a
34 years.
Okay, this is serious stuff. I've been to Stanford's campus. I mean, it's a great place, very serious academic institution. Your background, organizational psychology, you're in the management, teaching management. Take me back 10 years ago or so, roughly, as you were putting your first interesting titled book out. Talk about the use of the word asshole, because I got to tell you, I mean, it's the guy who's written books. I can only imagine what would have happened initially when you first put this across serious publishers' desks.
As you say, it was just an accident. What happened was, I'm part of an academic department, but that's called Management Science and Engineering, but we were merged out of existence. We had another department I was part of that was merged out of existence called Industrial Engineering, and we actually had a no asshole rule. I was kind of used to that. One thing that was a really important fact was in the early 2000s, my wife was actually managing partner of a large law firm. I was living in a no asshole rule environment and she was managing assholes. So we kind of had a lot going on with that. I wrote this little essay for Harvard Business Review. What happened was Julia Kirby, who was my editor at that time, she kind of calls and says, so we're doing something on management breakthroughs. Got any breakthrough ideas? I said, well, I have an idea. It's called the no asshole rule, but it's not a breakthrough. My father told me about it when I was a little kid, so I don't think it's new. And you're too wimpy to publish the word asshole anyways in the Harvard Business Review. Well, so I wrote this essay. They called it More Trouble Than It's Worth. I don't remember the exact number of times, but I put the word asshole in at least 10 times on the theory they would cross out almost all of them, and they left them all in. So this is 2004. I got so many emails, and that was probably by then my 8th, 7th something Harvard Business Review piece. And usually you get like 5 emails and 1 speaking gig that falls through. That would sort of be my average HBR article. 200 emails, all these stories. So I realized there was a market there. So I wrote a book proposal. Ironically, Harvard Business Review said they would take the book, but wouldn't take the asshole title. I had a editor call me, and you've written books before, so my literary agent put the thing out for bid. Then Warner Books, a guy named Rick Wolf, calls me up and says, "Hi, I'm the asshole who bought your book." And it's been sort of all gravy from there. And it is kind of funny using the term. I mean, I don't even swear very much in class anymore at Stanford. I learned that some people are uncomfortable with it. The reason I was so insistent on using the word asshole, both in the last book and the new book, The Asshole Survival Guide, is that when I see somebody treat somebody else like dirt, that's the word that comes to my mind as a sort of self-control mechanism. When I'm bad, I say, "Bob, stop being an asshole." And apparently I'm not alone in this regard. So that's sort of how it came about. It was an accident. And as you say, I continue to do work on organizational change and innovation and leadership. But the asshole stuff does come up, and it is a problem in organizations.
It almost feels like, I'm going to make this kind of silly analogy to a superhero alter ego. It's almost like you have this one world that you're in, and you've got this kind of side project over there that you're now known for. You have these two different personas. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, sometimes it feels like that, although sometimes the worlds do collide. I'll give you an example, since there's a lot of discussion in the Bay Area about Uber. And my last book was actually on scaling, spreading excellence, and they really are an example of an organization, from what I can tell from the outside, that has both asshole problems and scaling problems. And the asshole problems are caused by scaling too fast, perhaps by an asshole being in charge.
I was going to say, they might have some of the CEO as well, huh?
From what I can tell, that might be part of the story, but part of the story also is that they move so quickly. And there's a number of other startups that have gone through this phase, by the way, including Microsoft, at various points, that scaled so fast that they, another one is called the HubSpot, I think, that they just didn't have time to get anything resembling controls in, and it turns into this sort of Lord of the Flies situation, and then they got to kind of get things under control. It is there's other things that cause it too, but it isn't just as simple as having an asshole in charge. Sometimes it's just people who are busy and look the other way.
Let me start to tear this apart here a little bit and get people into your thinking. For example, I've got in my hands here the Asshole Survival Guide, which is the follow-up to the No Asshole Rule. This is the first time actually on an interview I've had a chance to use the word asshole in 5 years.
Thank you. I'm honored. You're way ahead of the New York Times.
But what happened when you put the book out? You put the first book out, and if I'm not mistaken, 800,000 plus copies, maybe over 1 million by now, who knows? But it's a huge number for a book. I mean, it's crazy.
I was shocked, and certainly my publisher was shocked. I don't know what happened, but
the bank accounts were not shocked. Those were good.
So the thing that was most surprising, though, and who knows what will happen with this book, the book sold in the United States market about 100,000 copies the first year, 2007. The most shocking thing was how well it did in translation. And if you've ever done translation rights for your books, you'll see that you get I don't know, couple thousand copies here is a lot, but it sold really a lot in Europe, especially in Italy. The first year it sold 133,000 copies in Italian.
Wow.
So I went and I visited Italy. And the other thing about that's actually kind of in some ways surprising and entertaining is that most people have the same reaction that you do to the book, that to the word, that it's both sort of silly, but it's also serious, because it is a very serious problem. We can talk about how much damage people do to people who treat others badly. But in Italy, they were very serious about it. I mean, I would do things like I would have panels with the Minister of Labor and senior politicians and business leaders, and they were very serious about it. The thing that I also have subsequently realized is that the reason that it's a serious problem, and it's also sort of funny, is that, people make jokes about it, and I get all sorts of asshole jokes. Like there's one in the book that I still love, which is that if you're in a room and you don't see an asshole, that means it's you. Things like that. People tell me jokes like that constantly. Are you an asshole magnet? Things like that. Is that it's dealing with people who make us feel demeaned, de-energized, disrespected, which is sort of the way that I think about assholes. It's a problem for all of us our entire life, dealing with bosses, dealing with friends, dealing with roommates. If we look at the evidence, especially in the last years that's piled up, is that when people make us feel bad about ourselves in that way, it actually has all sorts of negative effects. So it's a serious problem, but it's also something that people joke and laugh about, because that's one of the ways they can survive it.
No, it's a serious book. This is not, you're right. It's a great title. It's catchy. I'm sure plenty of people, perhaps in an airport, did not understand the seriousness behind it. There's a lot of scholarly research behind where this book goes, and probably just picked it up for the title alone,
I hope so.
Yeah, for sure. Let me go into that Italy thing for a second. That's really curious. I know with translations of titles, book titles, at least in my experience, they often change these things. The foreign publishers will change the titles to something they think is better. Was the translation in Italian, for example, was it 1-to-1 in terms of the word asshole?
So this is a great question. With every country, so I hate to say it, but there's almost a 1-to-1 correlation between the dirtier the title, the better it's sold. So my Italian's terrible, so some Italian listeners going to correct me. But the Italian translation was metodo anti stronzi, which the literal translation is apparently the method against shit. So that's what apparently in Italian, a stronzi is sort of like a piece of shit. So it does make sense if you're Italian. And my French is terrible, but apparently the French title was really, really strong, and it had every synonym for assholes in the subtitle. And so it sold well in France. But I'll give you an example of one where it didn't work in Spain. So my Spanish editor wanted to call it El Stupido. And I had this whole army of Spanish-speaking people who all thought that was ridiculous. And he called it El Stupido, and it sold badly, and he later wrote back and said I was right. So the translation does matter.
Let me offer for the audience really quick a quick reminder that you are currently a professor of management science at the Stanford Engineering School, and you have a PhD in organizational psychology. So we are joking around a little bit. We're going to get into the depth right now, but this is a really serious subject, as you've hinted at. What I want you to kind of paint the picture for is you put this book out initially 10 years ago, all these great sales, all this great translations, and you've already started to hint at this, the feedback. You've gotten an absolute ton of feedback in what you've been doing for the last 10 years, even though you've not been concentrating on this for the last 10 years alone. You set aside the last year to get this done, the new book. But talk about the feedback and the volume of feedback.
Well, so this is one of the weird things that happen is, okay, so I put the book out there, and every cocktail party, every social event, people will tell me their stories about the difficult people they deal with. And I'm a psychologist, but I'm not a therapist, by the way, so it's sort of challenging sometimes. The number of emails I would get, and as I say, the big motivation to write the book, the first chapter is called 8,000 Emails, was just this deluge of people talking about their issues. And the range of people were absolutely stunning. For some reason, priests and rabbis, I got lots of emails from priests and rabbis, from priests and also a Baptist minister about asshole parishioners. That's actually a big issue. Then I get emails from school teachers about their asshole principals, from principals about assholes parents. I mean, it was just coming from all different directions. And then from the U.S. Army, just almost anybody who you can think of, legal secretaries. Probably the sector of the economy where I got the most number of emails, requests, and conversations was healthcare. Because if you think about how healthcare is organized, it's very hierarchical. There's a lot of time pressure. There's a lot of sleep deprivation. Those are some of the elements that really do breed nasty behavior. So I always say, if you want to turn somebody nasty, give them power, put them in a hurry, and make them sleep deprived, and you will get a nasty person.
There's a big question people are asking you, and I'm quoting you here. Is essentially people are saying, help, I'm dealing with an asshole or a bunch of them. What do I do?
The last book, the No Asshole Rule, was about how to build a relatively asshole-free workplace. But this one really zeroes into your point on the question you just described. And it is something that people ask me every day. And to sort of divide it up, since I am an academic, if you look at research on the effects of people who leave us feeling demeaned, disrespected, de-energized, people who say, gee, that person's an asshole, the evidence that it's bad for us and bad for our productivity is so strong now. It's really hard to find a peer-reviewed study that does show that when somebody does that to you, you're less creative, you're less productive, you start having trouble sleeping. And if it's just a short little encounter, there's all these research where there's short little encounters. Just one study they did in Israel, they'd have an American doctor allegedly call them and tell them how dumb and incompetent they were. They do a worse job on a task where they would try to diagnose and figure out what's wrong with a little baby. I mean, all sorts of evidence like that. But the other side of the equation, which is what the book really focuses on, which is, okay, somebody's making me feel like dirt. What do I do about it? There's a lot of studies that hint about what to do, but it's a little bit like practicing marketing or how you start a company or something. There's some science and there's some craft. So that's where I'm between the two. I try to draw on peer-reviewed research, but sometimes it isn't there, and you got to sort of go more with the craft and the stories. So I combine the two.
I've been thinking about myself recently, and I've been trying to prune people from my life. It's really kind of like fortuitous that I get a hold of your book. I haven't been defining what I'm trying to get rid of exactly, But I'm trying to get rid of assholes.
And I think we're all working on that. And one thing in that feeling, so at least I won't speak for you, but when I say I'm trying to get rid of assholes, and this is one difference also, one thing that has evolved over the last decade, is that the people who I label as an asshole are people who make me feel bad about myself. Other people, they may not bother. But part of the thing about, to me, living the no asshole rule, dealing with assholes, is you've got to kind of be aware of who makes you feel bad and who doesn't, and maybe how you're contributing to the problem too. But still, on the pruning part, if somebody's making you feel bad about yourself, I think that's a good reason to get them out of your life if you possibly can.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. Let me go big picture here for a second. Some people are probably already having some thoughts in their head, and they're probably thinking to themselves, I know a lot of winners in my life. Or, for example, I think I've heard stories about Steve Jobs or the former CEO of Uber. It seems like to me that there's an ungodly number of winners who are assholes. So, Bob, tie this together for me. It seems like sometimes these assholes are winning.
There's two parts of it. First of all, whether somebody wins because they're an asshole or not, they're still bad for your physical and mental health and productivity to deal with. So it's going to be bad for the people around them no matter what. Steve Jobs and Travis at Uber, it was not easy to be around them. If you actually look at the evidence about who gets ahead in the workplace, there's a guy named Dr. Keltner at Berkeley in particular who has studied this, and also Adam Grant, University of Pennsylvania. And what it sort of looks like is it's sort of a chicken and egg problem, which is that the question of who gets ahead, in most situations, people who get ahead are people who treat people nicely, but then when they get in positions of power, they get worse and turn into assholes. One place I confess that there might be some exception is in entrepreneurship in the very, very early days where you need somebody really focused and driven. But if you look what happens, you look what happened to Travis and also Steve Jobs, and I talk about this in the book in the first few pages, is that so when you talk to people who know Steve Jobs well, and the person I especially quote is Ed Catmull, and I'm doing it with his permission. Ed Catmull was president of Pixar. He met with Jobs every week for 25 years. I don't know whether Jobs was not an asshole when he became famous, but the argument that Ed Catmull makes, and Ed knows a lot better than I ever did, I met him a couple times, but was that Steve Jobs only became the Steve Jobs who got rich, got famous and everything after he got forced out of Apple. He failed at Next and actually failed at the early days of Pixar for years. And Ed argues that although Steve could still be very pushy and very argumentative, he was a much better team player, much more empathetic and much more caring person. And that other Steve Jobs, although he could be difficult at times, was the one who really got famous. So he argues that the story is distorted. Now, other people might have other perspectives on Steve Jobs, but I thought that was an interesting counterpoint. And I would add that there are plenty of people who have gotten plenty rich without being assholes. Mark Benioff from Salesforce is a good example. I already mentioned Ed Catmull. And Warren Buffett's a pretty good example, too.
Even though I might be able to kind of find the assholes that were winners, from a psychological standpoint, if you're in their orbit, it doesn't make a difference. I mean, you can kind of like be stuck with the devil, thinking that it's going to rub off on you, and you're going to become super wealthy too. But your mental functioning might just go down the drain as well.
Well, yeah. Well, that's one also a characteristic of people who are assholes. And even they're successful, they do go through lots of different people. The other thing I think is actually really important for us to discuss, because in this conversation, and I fall into this quickly, we're acting like there's these good people and there's these assholes, right? But I think that the truth of it is that most of us under the wrong situations are capable of being assholes. And I talk about this just a little bit in this book, but in the last book, I talked about it much more. There probably are situations where leaving people feeling demeaned and de-energized might be to your advantage. And I'll give you an example. And there's actually an article, just devastating article in the Sunday New York Times this weekend about a woman whose ex-husband had died from complications from drug overdose. He was a lawyer at a large law firm, and she talks about the notion that one of the things that you hire a lawyer for is to be your asshole, right? Not so much in business law, but in litigation where it's a zero-sum game. You're paying your lawyer to make people feel demeaned and de-energized and to push other people around. That, and that's what they always say. Maybe you've heard the expression, he might be an asshole or she might be an asshole, but it's my asshole. And people like that, who are in occupations like that, it's really tough because, and this is a classic problem that lawyers have, and my wife managed a large law firm, as many as 1,000 lawyers for 8 years. I know about this problem. The challenge of them being able to turn it off when they talk to staff, when they talk to colleagues, really tough problem.
That's interesting because I can think of many instances over the years where I've had counsel and I've watched them in action. And I've just said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad he's on my side."
Oh yeah, that's right. That's the ones you want. So
right,
and that's why I go to this thing of feeling demeaned to de-energized. If it's a zero-sum game, if it's a one-shot negotiation, then probably having somebody like that, it actually might work. But to the extent you have cooperation or it's a long-term game, I talk about this feeling demeaned and de-energized, but there's a great book called Give and Take by Adam Grant, somebody I really admire, and a good friend of mine. And Adam shows essentially that if you're a taker and you just want to screw people in the short term, that's a pretty good short-term strategy. There's no doubt about it. But over the long term, his argument, and he has good data, is that people who are takers, who are givers, who help others get ahead, that because of the accumulation of favors, people feel like they owe you stuff, that they tend to do better in the long term. And, to go back to Steve Jobs, one of the things about Steve Jobs, it was really complicated. He was such a complicated person. If you were close to him and something was wrong with you, he was amazingly giving. One of a dear friend of mine, David Kelly, who's the founder of IDEO and the Stanford D School, he had cancer at one point, and this was when Jobs was in the absolute glory years. The iPhone was just coming out, and Steve would go to the Stanford hospital every day and show his love to David Kelly. And of course, one of the ways he would show his love to David Kelly was by yelling at the nurses on behalf of David because he is Steve Jobs, right? So this idea about exactly what an asshole is, one other thing that I also like to really emphasize is that we tend to people think sometimes we meet people who have kind of a rough exterior who might yell a little bit and think of them as assholes. But I talk about these people who are porcupines with a heart of gold. There's a lot of people in the world who are a little bit rough to take when you first get to know them, but the longer you get to know them, the better person you realize that they are. So it's a little bit complicated to unearth them.
You're getting to a point that you make throughout this newest work, which is being slow to label people assholes.
And fast to label yourself, because unfortunately, great evidence that shows that we human beings have terrible self-awareness. The worse we are at something, the more we overestimate our talents or our abilities. So if you think you have really high emotional intelligence, it might not be so true. So yeah, and one of the other things that I emphasize in the book is that the most reliable way to figure out whether you're an asshole in the short term or the long term is to have people around you who will tell you the truth. One of my favorite stories that's in the book, and I just have ever seen, there was this point right at the darkest point of World War II where Winston Churchill's wife, Clementine, wrote him not an email, obviously it didn't exist, wrote him a long letter in which she told him that he wasn't being very nice, and the pressure was making him, was driving away the members of his staff. The side effects of it was interesting. She pointed out the side effects were that if he continued to berate them and be nasty to them, they would be afraid to tell him the truth, and the whole nation would suffer. And this idea of having somebody in your life who can tell you the truth when you're being nasty or being incompetent, it's one of the greatest gifts that we all can have.
Let me slide you into depression, because this is something that we would not maybe intuitively think at first, and I would like you've kind of hinted at it in this conversation so far, but there's good evidence out there that a lot of people that might otherwise be suffering from what people might call depression could literally be their environment of people that are assholes.
And this is one of the cases you can generate helplessness, sadness, frustration just in a short laboratory study where somebody is rude to you. People will try less hard. They'll start feeling helpless. But if you look at the long-term studies of what happens when people face extended bullying, to your point, depression's a very common effect. There's even long-term studies that if you've got a boss, especially in the Scandinavia, if you've got a boss who's both incompetent and nasty to you, your chance of having heart disease are higher. And one of the things, and this, of course, we all know this is linked to anxiety and depression. One of the most consistent findings we see, especially with nurses for some reason, there's a lot of studies with nurses, that if you have a boss and colleagues who treat you like dirt, you'll tend to start having sleep problems. So yeah, to your point, if you want to get depressed, find yourself an asshole boss and colleagues is a pretty reliable way.
You've got some techniques a lot of different techniques you cover in the book, but one of the first things you talk about is like when you're trying to assess this situation. I'm in some work environment, I'm dealing with someone. How dire is the situation? How do people begin to determine, because we talk about being slow to label the asshole, how does one determine this level, the direness of the situation?
I would sort of just pick on three different things. One thing is just how much you're suffering. I mean, the worst shape, because it is one of those things, is how bad you're feeling about yourself. To me, that's the first one. The second one is essentially how much power you have. Because although, power is kind of a double-edged sword, it's something that can turn you into an asshole. But if you're being pushed around by people where you have power against them, either because of your hierarchical position or because you have a bunch of allies, and this is really important, if you're being attacked by an asshole or a bunch of them, if you got a bunch of friends on your side, you got emotional support, you got people to help you document what's going on, you're in much better shape. You have people to go to, just to complain. And then the last thing that I would really look for is that there's some situations where you might just have one stray person, hopefully who isn't too powerful, who's being abusive to you, and then it's not so bad. But if you're in a situation where it's a systemic disease and everybody around you is treating one another like dirt, well, two things are going to happen. One, you have nowhere to hide, so you're going to have more and more problems. The other thing is, and I talk about this in the book repeatedly, and we have really good evidence of this right now, is that if you're in a world where everybody acts like that, they aren't going to change. You aren't going to change them. You're going to become like them. This notion that negative emotion is really, really contagious. It's really dangerous. So one of the most reliable way to become an asshole is to go hang out with a bunch of them.
There's a line that you have in your work that I just love. It resonates with much of the work that I do in kind of investing writing, and I can see it in venture capital. I can see it in a lot of different walks of life. You could see it in dating, and you could see it in relationships. You have this simple phrase which has just struck me, and the way you highlighted in the book, it's meant to strike me. I believe in quitting.
Oh, yes. So yeah, because the Vince Lombardo thing, winners never quit. Yeah, I do believe in quitting. And it's funny, you were talking about sort of ending relationships or earlier. Yeah, there's a good argument if you can get out. And there's all sorts of evidence. We know this in our lives with bad clients, with bad bosses, all sorts of evidence that when there's somebody in your life who makes you feel terrible, or a bunch of people, just getting away from them is one of the best things you can do for yourself. And one thing I do emphasize is that you got to be really careful about just doing the old take this job and shove it routine is not a good idea. There's all sorts of evidence that people quit like that, reduce their employment prospects and make enemies that hurt them. But getting the hell out it's really an important thing to do. And one thing, since you and I probably both have clients, there's also this notion that if you've got a client who's treating you like dirt, if you're really, really dependent on them, you might have to take it. And the last thing I want to do is send people in poverty. But lots of evidence that people fire clients. I mean, we see all what's going on with the airlines right now. One thing that isn't coming up very much is, and I know this especially from Southwest Airlines and JetBlue Airlines in particular, but most major airlines do have this thing where if you treat people like dirt and you're a consistently abusive passenger, you're not allowed to buy a ticket. To me, that's part of what it takes to deal with nasty people is to be able to be ready to separate yourself from them.
It's an interesting thing you bring up the airline, and I'll go off on a side tangent here, and you might run with it as well. So I told you I'm in Asia, and I travel back and forth between the states. I often fly on the Japanese carrier ANA. It's a beautifully serviced flight. It's just fabulous. I have done flights to and from Asia and the U.S., and what people might not understand about what does, it's a seniority system. Those flights are worth... Right. Those flights are worth the most, so they get literally the oldest people. I've had grandmas in business class serving coffee over top of me with their arms shaking like they have Parkinson's. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with grandma having Parkinson's, and I might have it right now for all I know. But the point being is that, the airline situation is really an interesting microcosm of where you can see all these different things butting up against each other.
And if you think about it, if you want to create assholes, I mean, if you want human beings to be bad, what do? You put them under pressure. You create status differences. You make them a little bit anxious because they think they're, because of the fear of flying. It's unbelievable. So there's an interesting study. This actually isn't in the book, but one of the researchers who is cited a lot in the book, her name is Katie DeSellis. She's a professor at Toronto at the Rotman Business School. She did the study that shows that when there's first class and business class in a plane, there's more likely to be air rage by both people in first class and business class. And in particular, I love this, in the airplanes where you walk through, where people in coach walk through business class and they see the people sitting there with their little drinks and fancier big seats, it's especially likely to happen because it gets more vivid. She also did some research called on fights before flights. And she found out that, of course, the longer the delay, the more likely people are to yell at people who work for the airlines. But she also found that screaming babies were one of the things that really caused people to go off. So all this sort of crazy stuff. But yeah, airlines are a terrible situation, and they keep putting more and more pressure on us and crowding us, and it keeps getting worse. I hope that it starts getting better.
You just hinted at it, and I think in post on this interview, I think I'm going to beep out the mention of the one carrier that I just said something bad about.
Yeah, you probably should. But that one carrier, I think it's important to beep out stuff. I start out a chapter in my last book about how bad is. So I'm on the record. So do whatever you want.
We're going to beep them.
We got to protect our clients. So let's go.
And that's another aspect of this, though, is that, and we could just use airlines as a jumping off point, but when you have a situation where you're being treated badly by assholes, and you can't do anything because you literally have no other option. And there's probably many more examples than a flight. But for example, going to the U.S. Post Office, I can pick on them. The government's not going to come after me. Okay, but if I go to the U.S. Post Office, generally the customer service is not going to be what you might see in the private sector. There's a little more edge to them. It's tough when you have to deal with assholes and you can't get around them.
The post office, I think that the main hope, I end up going to Federal Express, but that's not a very good solution. Sometimes you have to go. But let's back up and talk about clients, though. One of the things that happens with clients and customers who are assholes is that might sort of help them get the message, or if they don't, will make you feel better. And I call this asshole taxes. But in every occupation I've known well, if you are somebody, by the way, especially law firms and professional service firms, and I won't name any professional service firms, but this applies to every single one that I know, that if you're a client who treats people badly, a couple of different things happen. One is that people will hesitate to give you the service that you start demanding, and this especially happens in law firms and the major consulting firms, is, so if you've got a nasty client, who is going to end up with them? Is it the partners and the younger folks who are great, or is it the ones who are weaker and don't have any bargaining power? You end up with weaker help. And the other thing that happens is this thing I call asshole taxes, which is that there's a lot of situations where people will charge you more money just because you treat them like dirt, and they do it as a way to sort of make themselves feel better. So if you're an asshole client, you may be paying for it and not realize it.
To add to the thing on the airlines, though, too, look at the kid that was just flying from Seattle to Beijing, and they had so look, it's not just, for example, airline staff being assholes. It's passengers on airlines being assholes. It's the full circle.
Everybody has the potential to go after everybody else. And one thing I will say about pilots and about most people working on airlines, they are remarkably patient given how horrible the situation is.
For sure. 100%.
It is funny. So a friend of mine I got to be careful how I identify her, but she's an executive in an airline, and she's been in the business a long time. She says that one of the most important things, and this is about cooling people out, and this has got to do related to one of the things you do with assholes, is she says what the best captains will do when things are going south, when the plane's on the ground, or even if it's in the air, because they can walk out of the cockpit, they'll walk over and gently talk to folks to just sort of calm them down, and how effective it can be. Even in that case, you can have people who engage in leadership and cool folks out. But you were asking about different ways, if you're stuck with assholes, what to do about them. In the workplace, one of the things, and I've got a chapter on this, is the way that I think about essentially people who are toxic. It's like this thing that it's like a disease that you can catch, and there's actually some great research that shows that if you are within 10 or 12 feet of a toxic coworker versus 25 or 30 feet of a toxic coworker, you've got about twice the chance of turning an asshole yourself and of getting fired as a result. It literally is a disease. If you can create some distance between yourself and them. Another thing that I sort of learned about dealing with assholes, and I talk about this in the book.
Can you pause for 1 second, Bob? What you just said, though, about it being a disease, I don't want you to jump. I want you to continue and move to the next point. But we could probably literally, what you just said in that one sentence, we could talk for hours about it being a disease that literally travels from person to person.
It's a contagious disease, and you can catch it from other people. You can obviously give it to other people. And it's also a disease in that it makes you sick, and you can pass it on to others. And one of the things that I suggest, to the extent that you can, is if you can walk out of a situation. Obviously, you can't jump out at 30,000 feet, but maybe you can move your seat, maybe not. One of the other things that I always suggest is that if you have somebody who's a known asshole you've got to deal with, try to meet them with them as rarely as you can. I talk about somebody whose name I can't use here or in the book, she had a really terrible dissertation advisor who would call her and send her all these nasty emails, and she learned this rhythm thing, which was when he would send a nasty email or leave her a nasty telephone message, she'd wait longer and longer and longer to respond, just to sort of slow the rhythm. So that rhythm stuff's really important. I recommend, if you can, avoiding meetings with them, walking out of meetings. Well, one of my favorites, and this is a story that's the end of one of the chapters, there's a woman I know who was a CEO. So there's some discussion in the book of board holes or douche boards. So and we tend to think of CEOs as being all powerful, but at least I'm in Silicon Valley. You talk to the CEOs here, and they'll talk about how nasty their boards are sometimes. And there's some really horrible board members. And so she had this board member who used to scream at her, literally scream at her for 15 or 20 minutes. So she'd always talk to him on the telephone. She wouldn't meet with him in person. And she did this thing. I just love it. She would turn the volume down on the phone so she couldn't hear him scream. And she'd put her feet up on her desk and do her toenails, and just occasionally turn the volume back on to let him know he was there. And after he'd calmed down after about 15 or 20 minutes, then she'd kind of talk to him. But I just love the image of the CEO with her feet up on the desk, painting her nails, pretending to listen on the phone. And to me, that's doing what you can to avoid having the force of the toxins be quite as strong.
Taking those examples that you just mentioned, let me reduce it to a line from your book, which I really love, which is, I think I want to put this up on my wall. Quote, "Don't engage with the crazy," end quote.
From Katie DeSellis. Yes. She's a quite famous researcher. So yeah, if you can avoid, but sometimes you can't avoid it.
Yeah. Let me shift it to something which I think is, we're kind of talking about the interpersonal. So much of us today, and I've got two nephews, they're basically early teens, and they're going to be going through a life that's quite different than perhaps the one that you and I have seen. And so much of their asshole conflicts are going to come from online. Now, I'm going to get it in because I feel like, as a serious book and as a serious guest, and you referenced this great blog passage that I went and read from David Kendrick, but I felt like I need to be able to get this for the first time in 5 years on this podcast. What makes a fuckhead? Right. I felt like, so I felt like
that 1994. You're talking about the earliest days of the web. And remember there was message boards? Some of your listeners aren't old enough to remember. I have children who are adults who were born in 1994.
That's a timeless piece, by the way.
Timeless. It's unbelievable. So one of the things about what makes, a fuckhead, to use a term, and the evidence is actually, you and I are even in danger now because, is that any time you're in a situation with somebody, even when you know them, if you can't make eye contact with them, that's when the risk goes up. You can see that there are some people, and by the way, I would include myself. My biggest asshole moments tend to be over email because I'm a writer, and you don't see their eyes, and you get that, and you start getting pissed, and that's one of the biggest risks. Because anytime you have eye contact, it's really a problem. So if you look at the modern world that we live in, this isn't just the problem of strangers. It's that when we are in work situations where there's distributed work, there's distributed teams, that once we get on email, our chances of, or any sort of texting, anything, Facebook, where you can't see their faces, we're really at risk. One of my favorite examples, I had a student who was in a group, a platoon. In Afghanistan, it was about 25 or 30 folks, and they just had an intranet. They didn't even have an internet because they were just out in the middle of nowhere, out in the country. And he said every night we would go to sleep, and we would go into our foxholes and our bunkers and stuff, and we would start communicating on the intranet, and by the next morning, we'd all hate each other because they'd all start writing nasty messages just because they didn't have eye contact with one another. So I remember him saying that his commanding officer told him they couldn't send messages anymore because it was just undermining the morale and interpersonal dynamics. And to me, that's sort of a microcosm of that problem. But yeah, it's not going to go away. But one thing I think that does happen to most of us, that there's some hope for, is that we all start getting more experienced at both when somebody's nasty, just cutting it off, and when we're nasty, the next time we see somebody apologizing. But it's really a tough problem. It's a worldwide problem.
Let's keep it on the online for a second, because I think you and I are in a situation where there's some element of public figure. If someone Googles me, they're going to find a lot of stuff that's generally positive over the course of a career. It's going to be the same for you. It's kind of like a wall of defense to some degree. So if somebody wants to troll you, if some asshole wants to troll you, and they want to say the worst things under the sun, well, it's going to kind of be diffuse. It's not going to really get to the core of Bob Sutton. It's not going to get there. Kind of same with me. However, if you're just a regular person, you get into, you're online and you're social media and stuff like that. And all of a sudden you get caught in the crosshairs of trolling. And perhaps it becomes mob trolling. Perhaps it gets really asshole terrible, perhaps even beyond asshole. That's a really difficult situation to be in because there's nowhere to run. And when those trolls start going after you, if you are kind of a private figure, all of a sudden it's the only thing Google sees.
Yeah, and they don't know anything. You have no allies. It's just terrible. And by the way, that a microcosm of that does happen, and that's where you get, in high school. And this used to happen on Facebook, where both my kids went through this, where somebody would just be attacked at night on Facebook, and it would just be terrible. Yeah, so that's where the mobbing really comes in. And to your point, if you're not a public figure and just one negative thing comes out, it's really a problem. And by the way, even for semi-public figures like us, there's certain things that and every now and then I make a mistake and kind of blow it. I try to avoid two things. I try to avoid talking about politics because honestly, here in the U.S., things are so divisive that if you start taking one side or the other, I don't think people can even process. They get so nasty. And I'm a political person privately, but publicly, it just doesn't help. Everybody just gets so hostile about it. And then the other thing that I try to do is when I disagree with somebody, to try to disagree with them politely. But I've noticed every now and then I've had to withdraw a tweet or something that I've sent out because I didn't mean to be nasty, but I might have gotten overly nasty.
But I got to go that example of the private person that encounters the trolling assholes. Is there any good technique other than avoidance and just kind of hoping over even though they don't have a news cycle, their private news cycle, 24 hours, that it will go away? Or, because that could really damage folks, and I've seen it happen to them.
In that situation, if you can't find some allies, the evidence is all you can do is to block people, unlink them, and this is where the self-control part comes from. Is just don't look at it. And this is one of the things that just taking yourself off of Facebook or Twitter, if you start getting in the middle of one of those storms, is probably the best. To me, it's the moral equivalent of quitting a job, right? Or leaving the room. That unless it's so severe that like the news media is coming to your house or something, then you're really in trouble. But if you're just in the middle of a storm, doing all you can to disconnect and remove yourself from the situation might be the best thing you can do for your mental health. Because to me, it's the same as walking out of the room where it's nasty.
When people think about where we're going today, and we've kind of been fun with the term and everything, but At the end of the day, people, they're not to blame if they come into contact with these assholes. It's not us. It's not you. It's the asshole. And you've been talking about this throughout our conversation, but I think it's really important to discuss the idea that you are not to blame for the asshole.
Well, and if you can't get out, and I've got a chapter on, I call them mind tricks, and we haven't talked much about fighting back. There are times when you really should fight back, when you can fight back, if you think you've got a reasonable chance of winning, if you've got a posse, if you've got evidence. But there's also times when you're just stuck in a bad situation. There's one woman who wrote me, I had a lot of email interaction with her. She was clerking for a federal judge. She was a lawyer. And she had clerked a year before. It was a great experience. She had this just judge who was constantly screaming at her. And then her coworkers, her fellow clerks, they caught the contagion. They were screaming. It's just a nasty situation. And she just had to get through the year. And my first reaction was, why don't you quit? And she said, well, I've got student loans. And if I bail out of this clerkship, basically my career is ruined. So what do you say to somebody? It's like, so you just got to take it. And this ability to find it in yourself, to have some emotional detachment. One of the techniques I especially like, which is quite evidence-based, is, especially if you're somebody like a clerk like that, to remind yourself that a year from now, this will be in the rearview mirror. This isn't going to last forever. Try to engage in as much emotional detachment as you can. Where I work at Stanford, most people are pretty civilized, but we have our share of assholes too. And one of my favorite administrators, he has this thing. What he does is when he's in a meeting with somebody who's really nasty, he pretends it's funny because he pretends he's a doctor who studies assholes, and what a fascinating case it is. So he uses this, which is a detachment strategy I use too sometimes more successfully versus less successfully. But that ability to sort of detached and feel sorry for the person, and maybe even try to convert them. Because sometimes when you deal with somebody who's nasty to you, they might not realize the harm they're doing to you. So sometimes you can reason with them. Sometimes you can gang up on them and fight back. There's a lot of times, for all of us are going to have some people in our life who just drive us crazy and leave us feel hurt. And the question is to how not to suffer damage.
Yeah, that fighting back part, it's often about the timing. It makes me think of like classic books like Sun Tzu's Art of War.
Right.
I mean, you really, it's not something sometimes just the immediate counterpunch to an asshole or a troll is often not the best strategy.
And that's in fact, there's a story I tell in the book that I went to in some detail, but I could have written pages about this. So once I was at this conference, and it was for people who ran community colleges, big conference. And this guy describes to me this entire sort of 7-part act or whatever of how they got rid of their abusive chancellor. And this guy was a severe narcissist, really severe. And if you know anything about narcissists, anything short of brown nosing, they need constant flattery. That's what they need. So what he and his colleagues they just kissed his ass constantly. But what they did was they built a case against him and brought the whole board of overseers or whatever it was together, and they just got rid of him really quickly. But he said, we kissed his ass till the minute he got fired because we knew that was our only hope. And I have a couple of reactions to that. One is it's actually kind of sneaky and kind of sleazy. But on the other hand, when you have a narcissist, if you start challenging them and telling them the effect on you, what you end up with is somebody who hates you. So that was one of the sneakiest ones that I ever heard of. In other cases, it can be done more legalistically and the like, or it might be an organization where there's just an occasional asshole and you have power over them. But that one just amazed me.
Well, we've given people if they haven't read the first book, we've given them a 2-book assignment now. But beyond your 2 books, I'm really curious if you would pass along to my audience, where is your reading these days? What's intriguing you, whether it's books or websites? What inspires you over the course of a week?
Okay, anything by Adam Grant. He wrote this great book called Give and Take. There's a book, it's still just doing great. There's a book by a woman named Kim Scott, who was a Google executive. She was at Apple for years, and it's called Radical Candor. And the argument is how you break people bad news without being an asshole about it. And then she talks about this notion of ruinous empathy, the problem of when you have people in your life, especially when you're a boss and you're constantly telling them how great they are, and not giving them the necessary feedback. So Kim Scott's book, Radical Candor, I would really recommend. And just another book that I think is still one of my favorite creativity books, Creativity Incorporated by Ed Catmull. And this one's really weird. One of my favorite books ever written, the guy's long dead, Orbiting the Giant Hairball. It was written by this guy. I think of his name in a minute.
I've got to buy that. I still don't have any idea what it is, but I got to buy that just for the title.
It's about this guy who was the creative paradox at Hallmark Cards, and it's about how to survive in a large, complex organization with some grace, and how to be a creative person. It's really an interesting book. Gordon McKenzie, I just remembered his name. So Ed Catmull sort of gives you the perspective on how you build a great creative organization or turn one around, as he and John Lasseter did with the Disney animation. Gordon McKenzie sort of gives you this crazy book with all these crazy drawings, because he designed greeting cards for a living, about how to survive with grace in an organization that sort of kills creativity. And all large bureaucracies have these sort of natural forces that kill creativity in the human spirit. So that's just sort of my weird sort of idea is Gordon McKenzie's Orbiting the Giant Hairball. Very short book with weird drawings.
I'm up for it, and I'll recommend to you, if you have not seen it, Jodorowsky's Dune, a documentary about this guy that wanted to make the film Dune in the 70s. It would have beat Star Wars to the punch for the first kind of star fantasy film, and it didn't happen. Mexican director, fantastic documentary, really cool stuff.
Sounds great.
It has nothing to do with our conversation, really, but I just thought of it. Hey, so the book, The Asshole Survival Guide, and the original, The No Asshole Rule, Bob Sutton. Everybody can find you at Stanford for additional work, and I'm sure they're going to go to Stanford and they're going to find all kinds of academic stuff that's going to make people think, hold on, was that the guy I was just listening to?
Well, I still am the asshole guy, so I'm both. Yeah, so I have a new website, bobsutton.net. It's probably the most efficient thing to send people to. It's got all sorts of different stuff. And my next adventure is probably around organizational friction, why it's so hard to get things done in organizations. So that's kind of the adventure I'm starting off on a bit with my old co-author, Huggy Rao. I'm still doing other stuff.
Well, Bob, I appreciate you taking some time today. Much fun.
It's great to talk to you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.